The leaves of this plant have cells that carry out photosynthesis. If we zoom in on this photosynthetic plant cell, we can see the chloroplast, where the reactions of photosynthesis occur. Photosynthesis consists of two primary steps, the light reactions and the Calvin cycle reactions. In this tutorial, we'll focus exclusively on the light reactions. The light reactions occur within the thylakoid of the chloroplast. Here, special pigments absorb light energy and transfer it to high-energy electrons, eventually producing ATP and the electron carrier NADPH. Let's zoom into the thylakoids to take a closer look at how ATP is created. The light reactions use two photosystems, called photosystem 1 and photosystem 2, which are both embedded in the thylakoid membrane. It's important to realize that these photosystems are named for the order in which they were discovered, not for the order in which they participate in the photosynthetic process. The light reactions actually begin at photosystem 2. The first thing that happens is that photosystem 2 receives photons, or light energy. This light energy is transferred to a chlorophyll reaction center, causing electrons in the reaction center to become energized. These electrons become so energized that they escape photosystem 2 and move to a nearby electron acceptor molecule located in the electron transport chain. Meanwhile, to replace the electrons leaving photosystem 2, water is split, releasing oxygen, 2 hydrogen ions, and 2 electrons. The first set of electrons continues to move down the electron transport chain, releasing stored energy as it moves. This energy is used to create a hydrogen ion gradient. A protein in the electron transport chain pumps hydrogen ions from the stroma into the thylakoid space. This creates a high concentration of ions in the thylakoid space relative to the low concentration of ions in the stroma. This gradient contains a large amount of potential energy, which is used by an enzyme called ATP synthase. The hydrogen ions flow down their concentration gradient through a channel in ATP synthase, releasing energy in the process. ATP synthase uses this energy to add a phosphate to ADP, forming ATP. Let's zoom back out for a moment and return to our chloroplast. Remember from the beginning of this tutorial that the light reactions produce both ATP and NADPH. We've just seen how ATP is produced, but what about NADPH? Let's zoom back in to take a closer look. Notice these electrons over here where we left them at photosystem 1. As photosystem 1 absorbs additional light energy, the electrons again become energized, escaping photosystem 1 and moving down the second electron transport chain. Electrons from the electron transport chain adjacent to photosystem 2 replace those in photosystem 1. And again, water is split to replace the electrons that have moved from photosystem 2. At the end of this electron transport chain, the energized electrons and a hydrogen molecule are used to reduce NADP to NADPH. Let's zoom back out to review. The light reactions use light energy and water to produce ATP and NADPH. Oxygen gas is released as a byproduct. Together, the ATP and NADPH formed during the light reactions are used by the Calvin cycle reactions, which are discussed more in depth in a separate tutorial. The important thing to remember from this tutorial is that plants need both light and water to survive. Without these ingredients, the light reactions would shut down, stalling photosynthesis and causing the plant to die.
The thylakoid membranes contain specialized molecules that work together to perform the light reactions. Light is absorbed by protein pigment complexes called photosystems. There are two photosystems, photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. The photosystems transform light energy to chemical energy by exciting and then shuttling electrons from molecule to molecule in a chain-like fashion on the thylakoid membrane. This process is called an electron transport chain. Let's take a closer look to see how this process works. First, photons of light hit chlorophyll, a light-absorbing pigment in photosystem 2. Electrons in the chlorophyll are excited to a higher energy level. The excited electrons are passed to an electron carrier. Meanwhile, water splits and releases electrons. These electrons replace those lost at photosystem 2. The byproduct of this reaction is oxygen, which is eventually released into the air. The other products are protons, or hydrogen ions, which are released into the inside of the thylakoid, or lumen. The excited electrons move to the cytochrome complex. Some of the energy from the electrons is used by the cytochrome complex to transport additional protons into the lumen. The second electron carrier, a protein inside the lumen, receives the electrons and passes them to photosystem 1. These electrons have now lost most of the energy they gained from light in photosystem 2. Photons of light hit chlorophyll in photosystem 1 and excite the electrons again. The electrons are then passed to the third electron carrier. Finally, these electrons are either recycled or they interact with an enzyme and NADP+, the final electron acceptor of the light reactions, to form NADPH. Some of the energy from light is now stored in the reduced molecule NADPH. Some of the energy released from the transfer of electrons established a proton gradient across the thylakoid membrane. Protons that accumulated in the lumen diffuse into the stroma through an enzyme called ATP synthase. ATP synthase uses the potential energy of the proton gradient to combine ADP with inorganic phosphate to form ATP. In this way, the potential energy is transformed into chemical energy stored as ATP. ATP and NADPH now have stored energy from the light reactions. This energy can be used in the Calvin cycle. This light-driven electron transport chain is usually continuous in the presence of sunlight. It encompasses a series of chemical reactions that involve light absorption, energy conversion, and electron transfer carried out by the photosystems and other enzymes on the membrane of the thylakoids.
आपको जरूर पता होगा कि फोटोसिंथेसिस क्लोरोप्लास्ट के अंदर होता है। फोटोसिंथेसिस के दो पार्ट होता है। सिर्फ पहले पार्ट में ही सोलर एनर्जी की जरूरत पड़ता है, क्योंकि पहले पार्ट में एटीपी प्रोड्यूस होता है और दूसरे पार्ट में लगने वाला सारा एनर्जी एटीपी सप्लाई करता है। तो चलिए देखते हैं किस तरह सोलर एनर्जी को ट्रैप किया जाता है। फोटोसिंथेसिस का पहला स्टेज होता है थाइलाकॉइड मेम्ब्रेन में। ये सारे डिस्क जैसे दिखने वाले पार्ट है थाइलाकॉइड। थाइलाकॉइड मेम्ब्रेन में प्रोटीन और पिगमेंट से बना हुआ एक बहुत ही कॉम्प्लेक्स सिस्टम होता है जो सोलर एनर्जी को एब्जॉर्ब करता है। इस तरह के दो फोटोसिस्टम होते हैं। फोटोसिस्टम 1 जिसमें एक जुड़ा स्पेशल क्लोरोफिल होता है जिसे क्लोरोफिल P700 कहा जाता है। P700 इसलिए कहा जाता है क्योंकि ये सनलाइट में से 700 नैनोमीटर वेवलेंथ का रोशनी को एब्जॉर्ब करता है जो होता है ब्लू लाइट। और फोटोसिस्टम 2 जिसमें एक जुड़ा क्लोरोफिल होता है जिसे क्लोरोफिल P680 कहा जाता है। P680 सनलाइट में से 680 नैनोमीटर वेवलेंथ का लाल रोशनी को एब्जॉर्ब करता है। अब ये पूरा इवेंट शुरू होता है फोटोसिस्टम 2 में। जब क्लोरोफिल P680 सोलर एनर्जी एब्जॉर्ब करता है तो वो एक्साइट होता है और एक इलेक्ट्रॉन बहुत ही हाई एनर्जी स्टेट में चला जाता है। अब इस इलेक्ट्रॉन की कमी को पूरा करने के लिए जल का मॉलिक्यूल टूट जाता है। इस हाइड्रोलाइसिस की वजह से ही ऑक्सीजन पैदा होता है और हाइड्रोजन आयन पैदा होता है। मतलब ऑक्सीजन फोटोसिंथेसिस के शुरू में ही पैदा होता है। अब ये एक्साइटेड इलेक्ट्रॉन एक इलेक्ट्रॉन कैरियर से दूसरे इलेक्ट्रॉन कैरियर होते हुए फोटोसिस्टम 1 में जा पहुंचता है। पर इस दौरान ये इलेक्ट्रॉन धीरे धीरे अपना एनर्जी रिलीज करने लगता है, जिसके वजह से एक आयन पंप के जरिए क्लोरोप्लास्ट के स्ट्रोमा से बहुत सारा हाइड्रोजन आयन थाइलाकॉइड के अंदर आ पहुंचता है। अब फोटोसिस्टम 1 भी सोलर एनर्जी एब्जॉर्ब करता है, सो ये इलेक्ट्रॉन फिर से एक्साइट हो जाता है और ये दूसरे एक इलेक्ट्रॉन कैरियर में ट्रांसफर हो जाता है जो है फेरोडॉक्सिन। अब ये इलेक्ट्रॉन फेरोडॉक्सिन से जा पहुंचता है NADP+ रिडक्टेज कॉम्प्लेक्स में। इसके बाद ये इलेक्ट्रॉन NADP प्लस को NADPH में बदलने में काम आ जाता है। ये NADPH बहुत ही इम्पोर्टेंट है क्योंकि ये फोटोसिंथेसिस के दूसरे चरण पे कार्बन डाइऑक्साइड को ग्लूकोज में बदलने में महत्वपूर्ण भूमिका निभाएगा। अब थाइलाकॉइड के अंदर हाइड्रोजन आयन का डेंसिटी बहुत ज्यादा हो चुका है। कुछ हाइड्रोजन आयन पंप की वजह से आया है और कुछ हाइड्रोजन आयन पैदा हुआ है H2O मॉलिक्यूल टूटने की वजह से। लेकिन थाइलाकॉइड के बाहर हाइड्रोजन आयन का डेंसिटी बहुत ही कम है, इसलिए हाइड्रोजन आयन थाइलाकॉइड के बाहर फ्लो होने लगता है एटीपी सिंथेस कॉम्प्लेक्स के माध्यम से। इस दौरान एडिनोसिन डाइफॉस्फेट इनऑर्गेनिक फॉस्फेट के साथ रिएक्ट करके एडिनोसिन ट्राइफॉस्फेट या एटीपी पैदा करता है और इस एटीपी में बहुत सारा केमिकल एनर्जी सेव होता है। अब हम रियल प्रोडक्शन के लिए रेडी है। एटीपी फोटोसिंथेसिस के दूसरे चरण में एनर्जी सप्लाई करेगा और NADPH कार्बन डाइऑक्साइड को ग्लूकोज में बदलने में बहुत ही महत्वपूर्ण भूमिका निभाएगा। अब ये दूसरा चरण होगा क्लोरोप्लास्ट के स्ट्रोमा में। दूसरे चरण में सोलर एनर्जी की जरूरत नहीं पड़ता क्योंकि एटीपी सारा एनर्जी सप्लाई करता है। दूसरे चरण में होने वाले सारे रिएक्शन को हम डार्क रिएक्शंस भी कहते हैं, लेकिन हम इस दूसरे चरण को किसी दूसरे लेसन में सीखेंगे। अभी के लिए जस्ट एटीपी और NADPH को पकड़े रखिए क्योंकि हमें ग्लूकोज जरूर मिलेगा।
In order for plants to grow, they need inputs of carbon dioxide, water, and energy. The chemical process by which plants use these resources to manufacture glucose, the building blocks of plants, is called photosynthesis. In the process, oxygen gas is produced as a byproduct. The energy for photosynthesis originates in the sun and arrives at the earth as sunlight. This light has both a wave and a particle nature. The particles, or photons, are the smallest units of light. Photons oscillate along a path, which is measured as wavelengths. The light emitted from the sun contains photons in a wide spectrum of wavelengths, called the electromagnetic spectrum. Photosynthetic organisms use only a small portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, called visible light. Photosynthetic organisms contain pigments that facilitate the capture of wavelengths of light in the visible light range. The color of the pigment comes from the wavelengths of light reflected. Plants appear green because they reflect yellow and green wavelengths of light. Red and blue wavelengths of light are absorbed by these pigments and provide the energy that is used for photosynthesis. Within eukaryotic photosynthetic organisms, also known as photoautotrophs, the chemical reactions of photosynthesis occur within plant cells in specialized structures known as chloroplasts. Photosynthesis consists of two sets of reactions, the light-dependent reactions and the Calvin cycle. Within the chloroplast are small disc-like structures called thylakoids, which are surrounded by a fluid-filled space called the stroma. The reactions that synthesize glucose, the Calvin cycle, occur in the stroma. The light-dependent reactions occur in the thylakoid. It is here that conversion of light energy to chemical energy is initiated. In most photosynthetic organisms, thylakoids contain pairs of photosystems, called photosystem 1 and photosystem 2, that work in tandem to produce the energy that will later be used in the stroma to manufacture sugars. The photosystems of the thylakoid consist of a network of accessory pigment molecules and chlorophyll, the molecules that absorb the photons of light. Within the pigment molecules, the absorbed light energy excites electrons to a higher state. Photosystems will channel the excitation energy gathered by the pigment molecules to a reaction center chlorophyll molecule, which will then pass the electrons to a series of proteins located on the thylakoid membrane. Photons of light strike photosystems 1 and 2 simultaneously. We will examine what happens with the photons striking photosystem 2 first. The energized electrons are passed from the reaction center of photosystem 2 to an electron transport chain. The electrons lost by photosystem 2 are replaced by a process called photolysis, which involves the oxidation of a water molecule producing free electrons and oxygen gas. While this oxygen gas is a byproduct of photosynthesis, it is an important input to the cellular respiration pathways. As electrons pass through the electron transport chain, the energy from the electron is used to pump hydrogen ions from the stroma to the thylakoid, creating a concentration gradient. This gradient powers a protein called ATP synthase, which phosphorylates ADP to form ATP. The low-energy electrons leaving photosystem 2 are shuttled to photosystem 1. Within photosystem 1, low-energy electrons are re-energized and are passed through an electron transport chain where they are used to reduce the electron carrier NADP+ to NADPH. When the chloroplast is receiving a steady supply of photons, NADPH and ATP molecules are rapidly being provided to the metabolic pathways in the stroma. Therefore, the ATP and NADPH formed during the light-dependent reactions are used in the stroma to fuel the Calvin cycle reactions. The Calvin cycle consists of a series of reactions that reduce carbon dioxide to produce the carbohydrate glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. The cycle consists of 3 steps, the first of which is carbon fixation. In this step, carbon dioxide is attached to ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate, resulting in a 6-carbon molecule that splits into 2 3-carbon molecules. The second step is a sequence of reactions using electrons from NADPH and some of the ATP to reduce carbon dioxide. In the final step, ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate is regenerated. For every 3 turns of the cycle, 5 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate are used to reform 3 molecules of ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate. The remaining glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is then used to make glucose, fatty acids, or glycerol. It takes 2 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate to make 1 molecule of glucose phosphate. Thus, the Calvin cycle has to run 6 times to produce 1 molecule of glucose. These molecules can remove their phosphate and add fructose to form sucrose, the molecule plants use to transport carbohydrates throughout their system. Glucose phosphate is also the starting molecule for the synthesis of starch and cellulose. Plants produce sugars to use as storage molecules and structural components for their own benefit. By utilizing the energy of the sun, along with inputs of water and carbon dioxide, plants act as glucose factories. Photosynthetic organisms are the primary producers of glucose on the planet. They also produce oxygen gas as a byproduct, and thus serve as the foundation of life, providing food and oxygen for the complex food webs on both land and in the oceans.